West Columbia, South Carolina, was a small but thriving town where life flowed in a measured and peaceful way. It was a place where everyone knew each other and neighbors were always ready to help. The town was known for its cozy parks, small restaurants, and friendly residents. It was quiet, safe, the perfect place for a family and a happy life. One such resident was Lindsay Lee, a charming, friendly, and hardworking woman who was liked by all who knew her. She worked as a civilian employee of the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, a respected and stable position of which she was very proud. Her coworkers spoke of her as honest, dependable, and dedicated, always willing to help. Lindsay loved an active lifestyle, kept herself in good physical shape, regularly went to the gym, watched her diet, and strived for harmony in everything, both in life and in work. Her days were filled with positivity, socializing with friends, loving her work and taking care of herself. Outside of work, she spent a lot of time with friends, was a frequent guest at events, always genuinely enjoyed the successes of others, and never stood by if someone needed support. She loved traveling, trying new things, learning. She never sat still and was always looking for opportunities for self-improvement. But the biggest part of her life for a long time was her husband, Jason Lee. Their relationship began as a beautiful romantic story full of understanding, love, and support. Jason seemed like a reliable man who cared for her, showed her attention, was affectionate and devoted spouse. When they got married, their surroundings considered them a perfect couple. They looked happy, made joint plans for the future, enjoyed life together. Lindsay and Jason together bought a cozy house, arranged it, creating the perfect space for a happy family life. They made plans for the future, discussing family, career, traveling. Everything looked like they had a cloudless life ahead of them. Lindsay was sure that she had found her man, with whom she would go through everything, because there was so much love and warmth in their relationship. But, as often happens, the external image does not always reflect reality. As time went on, there were disagreements in their marriage. If at first Jason was an attentive, caring, and loving husband, then over time he began to change. He became more withdrawn, irritable at times, and his attitude toward Lindsay began to become strained. Lindsay didn't like to complain about her problems. She always tried to be confident, showing everyone that she was a strong and independent woman. Her coworkers and friends didn't notice anything because she didn't want to burden anyone with her worries. The 13th of March, 2017 started as a normal day in West Columbia. The city was living its usual life. People were rushing to work, bakeries were filled with the aromas of fresh coffee, and early visitors were jogging in the local park. That morning, Lindsay Lee didn't show up for work. To some, it might have seemed routine. Someone was sick. Someone was having a bad day. But her coworkers knew it was strange. Lindsay was never late, and if she was, she always gave notice. When there were no calls or texts from her by mid-afternoon, her coworkers became concerned. They called her, but her phone was turned off. This was an even more troubling signal. Lindsay always kept her phone with her, especially considering her job required prompt communication. Toward evening, the worry turned to anxiety. Her coworkers decided to go to her house to see if everything was okay. They knew where she lived and hoped she had simply forgotten to charge her phone or was sick. When they pulled up to her house, there was no sign of trouble. It was quiet, the door looked closed, and the windows were curtained to hide the view inside. However, upon closer inspection, they noticed a strange detail. The back door was broken in. That was the decisive signal. They didn't wait or guess, they called the police right away. When officers arrived on the scene, they inspected the entry area and confirmed that the door had indeed been broken into. Without waiting any extra minutes, they decided to go inside. What they saw shocked even experienced police officers. Lindsay Lee was lying in the bathtub. Water was running down her body and there were traces of blood all around her. When police discovered Lindsay Lee's body and looked around the house, the first thing that came to investigators' minds was a robbery that had gone awry. The broken back door indicated a forced entry, and the crime itself looked chaotic and violent. Perhaps the perpetrator wanted to take valuables, but something went wrong and he killed the victim for fear of being identified. This scenario seemed logical, but the longer forensic investigators studied the crime scene, the more it became clear that the robbery was just an illusion created by the killer to confuse the investigation. After carefully examining the house, the police immediately noticed the oddities. All belongings were still in their places, and there was no sign of any valuables being found in the house. Usually in a robbery, criminals pull out drawers, overturn furniture, scatter things in search of money, jewelry, valuable equipment. This one looked too neat. Lindsay's wallet was on the kitchen table. Her laptop was in the corner of the living room. Jewelry and expensive electronics were also untouched. It seemed as if the killer hadn't even tried to steal anything. It became obvious. This was no ordinary robbery. The killer did not act in panic and did not search for valuables. He came to this house for the sole purpose of killing Lindsay Lee. Moreover, as investigators investigated the crime scene, they came to another conclusion. The perpetrator clearly knew the house well. He chose the back door rather than the front entrance, indicating that he understood the layout of the building. Perhaps he knew that there was no security camera on that door, or that it was easier to open. This immediately suggested that the perpetrator might not have been a random intruder, but someone Lindsay knew. Another detail caught the forensics team's attention. There were practically no traces at the crime scene that could help in the investigation. Usually in such cases, there are fingerprints, shoe prints, blood spatters of the perpetrator, but here it looked as if the killer had carefully prepared and made sure not to leave any evidence behind him. He'd likely used gloves, cleaned up any traces he might have left behind, and may have even wiped his prints off the objects he'd touched. This required a certain level of coolness and preparation. The police concluded that the killer knew Lindsay Lee. He knew her habits, her daily routine, knew when she would be alone and defenseless. This crime wasn't an accident or the work of a street mugger. It was carefully planned. So investigators had to look for a suspect among those who were close to Lindsay, those who had a motive to harm her. After the police ruled out a random robbery, investigators faced the question, who could have wanted Lindsay Lee dead? To understand her surroundings, detectives began to question her friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. However, it soon became clear that she was not a person who willingly shared her personal life. At work, she was known as a cheerful, energetic, and outgoing woman who was always supportive of colleagues and friends, but rarely spoke about her problems. When asked about her family life, she only smiled and avoided answering, preferring not to go into details. However, the more investigators questioned her acquaintances, the clearer a different picture emerged, far from cloudless happiness. Lindsay's colleagues noticed a change in her behavior in the months before the tragedy. She became more thoughtful, sometimes anxious, sometimes appeared tired and tense at work. Some friends reported that she no longer seemed as happy as she used to. No one could say exactly what was bothering her, but everyone noticed one important detail: her husband, Jason Lee. Although Lindsay rarely talked about her personal problems, many people began to notice how her husband's behavior had changed. He used to seem like a normal, caring spouse, but in recent months he had become irritable, nervous, and at times aggressive. He controlled Lindsay in literally everything, interested in where she was going, who she was talking to, checked her phone, and often made jealous scenes. Some acquaintances said that he suspected her of cheating, although there was no reason for this. Lindsay's friend recalled a conversation that took place about a month before the murder. Lindsay admitted that she could no longer tolerate her husband's controlling and constant suspicion. She was adamant that their marriage had to end. She had already filed for divorce, and their official separation was to take place exactly 1 month after her death. This information dramatically changed the course of the investigation. The police now suspected Jason, but before taking any action, the detectives decided to interview his friends and acquaintances to get a sense of his experiences with the divorce. The results of these interviews proved even more disturbing. Jason's close friends revealed that he was furious about Lindsay's decision to leave him. He considered it a betrayal, blamed her for ruining their family, and said he wouldn't just let her walk away. Some acquaintances recalled him talking about her with hatred, claiming that she purposely wanted to humiliate him. In addition, it was revealed that Jason was experiencing serious financial difficulties. After breaking up with Lindsay, he had fallen into debt, racked up loans, and had virtually no money to live on. He had missed car payments, was on the verge of being evicted from his apartment, and didn't know how to pay off his debts. One of Jason's friends told police that in the days before the murder, he seemed especially tense. He talked about Lindsay all the time, complained that she had betrayed him, and even once uttered a phrase that seemed ominous to his interlocutor: "She's going to regret what she did." With this information, the police finally focused their attention on Jason Lee. He was now the prime suspect, but investigators knew they had to gather hard evidence before they could apprehend him. To better understand his psychological state and test his reactions, the detectives decided to bring him in for questioning. When Jason Lee appeared at the station, he seemed calm and collected. He showed little emotion and did not seem stressed. Even after the detectives informed him that his ex-wife had been brutally murdered, his reaction was surprisingly subdued. He asked no questions, expressed no shock or grief, but simply nodded and said he was willing to answer any questions. The detectives went straight to the main point. When was the last time he had seen Lindsay? Jason replied that they hadn't spoken in the past few weeks. According to him, their conversations had always ended in arguments, and after Lindsay had filed for divorce, he had decided to cut her out of his life completely. He stated that he felt no anger, but was disappointed with her decision. "I didn't see her or even try to contact her because it didn't make sense," he said. But investigators were in no hurry to take his word for it. They knew his acquaintances were telling them otherwise. Then one of the detectives noticed a scratch on his face. It was a deep cut that had not yet had time to heal. When the investigator questioned how he got the scratch, Jason almost immediately spewed out an explanation. "Oh, it's my cat. She can be aggressive sometimes," he said without hesitation. The detectives looked over at him. That answer sounded overly prepared, as if he had already anticipated the question. Besides, the police already had other information. His coworkers said he had explained the scratch differently, saying he had cut himself while shaving. This moment made investigators wonder, was he just nervous or was he trying to hide something? Despite this, the police had no direct evidence against him. His alibi had yet to be verified, and the DNA forensics from the crime scene were not yet ready. They could continue to monitor him, but technically they had no grounds for arrest. After a lengthy interrogation, Jason was released with a warning that the investigation was ongoing. As he left the building, the detectives noticed another oddity. He didn't seem alarmed or frightened. He seemed to have expected this outcome and knew he couldn't be detained just yet. But the police still had their doubts. Was it the calmness of an innocent man or the confidence of a criminal who believes he cannot be caught? Even though the police didn't have enough evidence to arrest Jason Lee after his initial interrogation, investigators weren't about to stop. They continued to work through the evidence, analyzing the data and looking for the slightest clues that could shed light on his involvement. A breakthrough in the case came when forensic investigators discovered a piece of latex glove at the crime scene. This fragment did not arouse much interest at first, but when it was sent for DNA analysis, the result was shocking. The glove contained Jason Lee's biological material. It was the first real evidence directly linking him to Lindsay's house on the night of the murder. But even that might not have been enough to prove his guilt in court, so the police continued to analyze other potential evidence. The next step was to examine electronic data. Detectives requested activity data from the Fitbit smart bracelet Jason wore most of the time. This bracelet could record his movements as well as his physical activity level. The analysis revealed an unusual pattern. On the night of the murder, his bracelet was completely inactive for 12 hours. This meant that he had either taken it off, knowing it might give away his whereabouts, or had been in one place, trying not to move too actively. Coincidence? The detectives doubted it. But another unexpected source of information helped move things along: Jason's new girlfriend. Investigators learned that he had started dating another woman a short time after Lindsay's death, but the best part was different. His financial situation had changed dramatically. Police had previously known that Jason was in deep crisis. He was in debt, missing payments, and on the verge of eviction. But after Lindsay's murder, he suddenly began to quickly hand out debts, pay his bills, and even told his new girlfriend that he wasn't worried about money anymore. Where did he suddenly get the money from? Investigators began analyzing Lindsay's financial transactions, and soon everything fell into place. It turned out that before Lindsay Lee died, she was preparing to sell their house together. This meant that she was to receive a large sum of money after the sale. Given that Lindsay had already filed for divorce, Jason could have lost control of that money. That's when the police had their final theory of motive. Jason Lee killed Lindsay not only because of hatred and jealousy, but also for profit. He knew that if she was gone, he could claim her share of the sale of the house. That explained his sudden financial stability, because the money he used after the murder was likely part of the funds he received after her death. The police realized they had no more time to waste. Jason Lee was the prime suspect, and now they had enough evidence to arrest him. After the police had gathered enough evidence to charge Jason Lee with murder, investigators wasted no time. They now had a string of evidence that clearly pointed to his involvement. DNA found on a latex glove, his bracelet's lack of activity on the night of the murder, his sudden financial stability after his wife's death, and a motive involving the sale of a house. Police realized it was time to act before the suspect tried to flee or destroy possible evidence. Jason's arrest took place in the early morning hours. Police officers arrived at his home, intending to take him by surprise. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not frightened. His face remained impassive, and he only asked what was the matter. But when they read him the arrest warrant for the murder of Lindsay Lee, there was tension in his gaze. He didn't resist, didn't ask questions, didn't try to justify himself. His demeanor seemed strangely calm, as if he was either already anticipating this moment or trying to hide his real emotions. When he was brought to the station for questioning, Jason remained confident. He denied involvement, claimed he hadn't seen Lindsay on the day of the murder, and assured the investigators that there had been no serious conflict between them other than the usual divorce-related disputes. However, detectives already knew that what he said did not match what Lindsay's friends and acquaintances had told them. They knew that he was angry at his wife for her decision to leave, that he had complained about her to friends, and that his financial situation had deteriorated since the breakup. Investigators were slow to accuse him directly, but gradually began to show him the evidence. First, they showed him the results of the DNA forensics. Jason froze for a moment, his face unruffled, but he looked away as if he were considering a response. He then stated that perhaps the glove had been left there by accident when he had stopped by Lindsay's house a few weeks ago. The investigators continued the pressure by showing him data from his Fitbit bracelet. When they showed him the data on his financial transactions and sudden repayment of debts right after Lindsay's murder, his confidence began to melt. He fidgeted in his chair, avoided direct eye contact, and took long pauses before answering. At one point, he asked for a glass of water and took deep breaths, as if trying to calm down. The detectives noticed a change in his demeanor. He was no longer as confident. His answers became less clear and his voice became strained. This culminated when the police presented him with evidence related to the sale of the house. Jason couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. He was nervous, lost for answers, his confidence gone. Realizing that further conversations would only make his situation worse, he suddenly refused to cooperate and declared that he would not say another word without a lawyer. This move was the final confirmation to the investigators that they were moving in the right direction. The interrogation was completed, and he was officially charged with first-degree murder. Now he was awaiting trial, but the police already knew they had enough evidence to prove his guilt. Jason Lee's trial began in November 2019 and attracted a lot of attention. It was a high-profile case that examined not just the tragic death of Lindsay Lee, but a cold-blooded crime committed by the man who was once her spouse. Prosecutors argued that the murder was premeditated and motivated not only by hatred for his ex-wife, but also by financial gain. Jason was in deep crisis, had no steady income, and was on the verge of bankruptcy. However, after Lindsay's death, he suddenly solved his money problems, which immediately made him the prime suspect. The prosecutor's office presented the theory that Jason was unable to come to terms with the fact that Lindsay was leaving him. Their marriage had already effectively ended, and the official divorce was to take place just a month after the tragedy. She was about to start a new life, but her ex-husband probably couldn't let that happen. In addition to the emotional aspect, he also had a financial motive, the division of property. After the divorce, he could be left without funds, but if Lindsay was gone, he could claim her share from the sale of the house. Jason Lee's defense insisted on his innocence, arguing that he could not have committed such a crime. His lawyers tried to convince the jury that he had no real reason to kill his ex-wife, and that he himself was shocked by her death. They also tried to insinuate that the police had no direct evidence pointing specifically to him, and that the investigation was too quick to focus on only one person, ignoring other possible leads. However, the court did not accept these arguments. After weeks of hearings, reviewing case files and hearing witnesses, the jury found Jason Lee guilty of first-degree murder and burglary. Judge Thomas Cooper, Jr. handed down a life sentence for Jason with the possibility of parole after 30 years in prison, emphasizing that the crime was brutal and elaborate. Jason Lee listened to the sentencing without showing emotion. He made no statements in court, but a few months after the verdict was announced, he filed an appeal. In his appeal, he argued that his rights had been violated during the investigation, and that the verdict was handed down without sufficient evidence. However, in July 2023, the court finally rejected his appeal, upholding his conviction. Jason Lee will now spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to escape responsibility for his crime. Lindsay Lee's story is a tragic example of how an unwillingness to let go of the past, a lust for control, and financial gain can lead to a heinous crime. Her life was cut short the moment she was ready to start over, free from a destructive relationship. But Jason Lee, the man with whom she once shared a family and a future, could not accept the loss of his power over her. This case shows how dangerous unresolved conflicts in a marriage can be, especially when one partner sees the breakup not as a natural stage of life, but as a personal defeat. Jason Lee didn't just kill his ex-wife, he calculated every detail, hoping to get away with it and use her death for his own gain. However, a thorough investigation and the evidence gathered did not allow him to escape justice. Despite all his attempts to deny guilt and defense tricks, the jury and the court delivered a fair verdict. He received 2 life sentences that permanently deprived him of his freedom, just as he himself once deprived his ex-wife of her life. This case is another reminder that violent crimes rarely go unpunished. Justice, even if it takes time, eventually catches up with those who try to avoid it. Jason Lee could have started a new life, righted wrongs, and moved on. But instead, he chose a path of violence that landed him in a jail cell for the rest of his life.